Hello, I'm Robert Rickover, an Alexander Technique teacher in Lincoln, Nebraska. I also teach in Toronto and these days mostly online. My guest today is Imogen Ragone, an Alexander Technique teacher in Wilmington, Delaware, who also teaches online. And we're going to perform a few little experiments today, which we'll dive into pretty quickly, and then I'll explain a little how these ideas originated. So, Imogen, welcome to the show.
Welcome. I'm always interested to find out what I'm going to be doing.
Imogen has no idea of what we're going to be doing.
Yeah.
And she has, at my instructions, prepared. She's sitting at a desk or a table of some sort, right?
Yep.
And,
I'm at my desk.
Somewhere on that desk is a glass, water glass, I guess, and a book. And we're going to be using those for the first couple of experiments. So, Imogen, let's start with the glass. Could you do everything you would do to pick it up and drink from it except pick it up? In other words, bring your hands to it and do what you would do just before picking the glass up and perhaps drinking from it.
So I'm just
your hand is around the cup, right? Or
yeah.
the glass.
But I've not started.
You haven't actually lifted it off the table yet. Just take a note of how much pressure you're putting on that glass with your fingers. Don't try to change it, but just be a little interested in just how tightly or not tightly you're holding the glass. And then you could put your hand back down again. Now, I'd like you, I'm going to introduce you to a kind of a new Alexander type direction. It'll be a negative direction, so it's I'm not direction. And the direction is I'm not doing. So you might just repeat that a couple of times to yourself. Just, I'm not doing. And at some point, continue with that direction and do the same thing with your hand and the cup, the glass. Now, is there any difference in how you, so could you, since we can't see it, and it doesn't really matter to see it, anyone at home could do the same experiment. Could you just, there it is in all its glory.
And I was doing when I just did that.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, what was the difference between those two envelopments of the glass?
Well, I thought I was doing pretty well the first time, actually. I didn't feel I was using undue pressure. I wasn't like gripping or anything. But the second time, or one, just even the going to the glass had a different quality with the I'm not doing. And just how my hand landed, and it just felt lighter. It was still definitely in touch. It didn't feel like I wasn't touching the glass or anything, it felt in contact, but different. But I also want to say that when you just very first mentioned that thought, that direction, I had a big breath just before we even started with the experiment.
Excellent.
I'm not doing. So it's like, oh gosh, that's a relief to my system somehow. Yes. So,
right. And we could repeat the experiment, but changing it a little to no moving of anything anywhere, but without any background direction or thinking about anything. Just imagine that you might pick it up.
So I'm only thinking about picking it up.
Just thinking about it. and see if you can notice anything happening within you with that thought, and just register that, and then let's come back to that direction. I'm not doing. And I think it's good to repeat it a couple of times, and then at some point continue gently thinking it and adding the idea, well, I might just pick up that glass. And is there any difference there?
It's very different. I felt an immediate, without the direction, an immediate pull to the right, forward and to the right, which is where my glass is, which specifically felt like attention, especially here. And when I brought that idea of I'm not doing to bear, even as I brought in also the idea of picking up the glass, it was very much less, felt much pleasanter indeed,
Right.
but very much less muscular firing up, or whatever you want to call it.
So I'd like to do one more experiment with you sitting at the desk. Are your feet presently on the ground, resting on the ground?
They are indeed.
Okay, so choose a leg. Let's say maybe whatever leg you want to choose. And if you were going to lift that leg, I don't want you to actually lift it, but if you were going to lift that leg up a little bit, could you do the very first beginnings of that movement, which probably involves some pressing down on the ground a little bit with that leg?
That's not what I noticed. I noticed a bit of pulling up away from the ground.
But we don't want the foot to leave the ground.
It didn't, but
okay, so you felt something going on, whatever it is. It could be a pressing down, it could be a moving up. Just register the nature of that movement that you did. And now again, come back to the direction I'm not doing, a couple of times repeating it, and then bringing it to bear as you do the same, have the same basic little movement, the beginnings of the same movement, really. And did it have a different quality to it?
It certainly did. I still felt the same sort of area. I mean, I was still, for me, the idea of lifting my foot off seemed to be mainly in my thigh, because that was the bit that was gonna, but it was a far less forceful. It felt easier. And with both, well, especially with the first, I could feel that effort, especially in this kind of right side of my neck again, and this and that again was much more easy. I guess my neck was freer.
It's entirely possible. So let's, I think this might be a good time to explain a little bit what this is all about. In the last few weeks, I've done a number of interviews with Penelope Easten, who's an Alexander teacher in County Clare, Ireland. I think you've probably seen some of them.
Yes, and so some of the concepts were familiar. I've actually watched them all. They're fascinating. I recommend them to anyone.
Well, she had lessons years ago with a woman named Margaret Goldie. She's usually called Miss Goldie. She was one of Alexander's first assistants, someone who basically he trained to be a teacher before the training course, and an early associate was around on the training course a lot. And she, unlike some of the other students of Alexander who kind of rose to prominence after he passed away in 1955, and they began having training courses, people like Walter Carrington and the Barlows and Patrick McDonald, and there might have been another one or two out there. She never, Miss Goldie never set up her own training course. And in fact, she seemed a bit isolated from the Alexander community. Some people had heard about her, but she was this mysterious figure. When I was in England, I heard about her towards the end of my time there from another student on my training course. And I wish I had gone to see her. I actually had been going to see her office mate, a guy named, I think John Skinner, I think that was his name. He was an Australian. And I caught a glimpse of her once, but I never actually went for lessons. But she had, I think it's fair to say, a very different approach to teaching the technique than most of the other teachers, from everything I can gather from other accounts of people who've had lessons with her as well. And I think the big difference was that she really emphasized what we would call inhibition, although she didn't actually use that term. But she placed a huge emphasis on what she would call stopping, or not to do, not doing, that sort of thing. And even to the extent that, from her point of view, that was way, way more important than directions. And that, in fact, the improvement, let's say, in the head-neck torso relationship came from the inhibition. It wasn't something you brought, in her view, ideally, it was something you would just stop doing, and your body would, if you did it well, I guess, your head-neck relationship would improve. And she was also she was also extremely critical of basically all of the other training courses in England. She even said somewhere something to the effect, they should all except one should be shut down. And then there would be just one that we could fix up to actually teach what Alexander taught. So she was a controversial figure, and probably not everyone's, for some teachers, probably not their favorite person to have around, but she did have a pretty interesting way of teaching. And Penelope and I have talked about that a lot, and there's some other people who have accounts of lessons with her. There's a really nice little book by a woman named Fiona. Can't think of her last name now, but she wrote a little book called Not to Do. And I have all that information on a little web page about Margaret Goldie. So when I was thinking about this, I realized that on my training course, inhibition as a topic really didn't come up very much. At least I don't remember it coming up. And I thought, well, it would be fun to explore those ideas. Now, Margaret Goldie had a way of helping people get to a place where they were not doing things, using her hands and using some verbal guidance. And I thought, well, I'm a direction kind of guy. I love Alexander directions. And of course, negative directions are sometimes called inhibitory directions. They have, in my view, they have inhibition built into them. But I thought, well, why not come up with some directions that would help me get at least closer to that place of non-doing? And I started experimenting with different phrases. And the two I ended up with to play with more than the others, the first one was a freedom direction. I'm free to stop. Margaret Goldie used the term stop a lot, meaning just don't do anything. So I'm free to stop, and I played with that a bit, experiment, doing the same exact kind of experiments I just talked you through, actually, picking up an object, lifting a leg. And then the other direction, which I tend to like more, is a negative direction. I'm not doing. And I just in the last week or so, I started using that with several of my online students, and they all were just blown away by it. And I thought, wow, that was quick. I'd have thought that would be, and some of them were pretty new to the technique.
Mm-hmm.
I thought that was surprising to me. And they all had pretty much versions of reactions to it, just that you did.
I think we're so set up to do that sending that message I'm not doing is
I'm not, I don't want to.
It's quite radical, actually.
Well,
but it's
yeah,
very,
it is.
very,
very
calming to the nervous system.
And saying I'm not doing, I don't think really means that you're not going to do anything. You might do something, but you're not doing anything just kind of in a background way.
Yeah.
And you're
or extra.
Yes. Yeah. And I can't, from the descriptions of the state people could get into working with someone like Miss Goldie, where they were totally kind of in a state of quietness, but not asleep, kind of like a cat observing a mouse, and totally present, but not moving, and just waiting for the right moment. And then there goes the mouse. I thought, well, at least maybe with well-chosen direction, I could get closer to that state. I haven't really been in that state very often in my life. Occasionally with cranial sacral work, I think I have, and perhaps once or twice otherwise, but I haven't, in my sense of myself, is I haven't actually been there very much. But I thought maybe I could get closer. Maybe it's not a binary thing. You could be less doing. And that's
absolutely. I think it's a continuum. Yeah.
And then so I performed that experiment. And then another way of using that thought is the way that we've explored a lot, just using an Alexander direction as you do an activity. Walking being a good example, where you use that thought, and then you shift over to a nonsense thought like I'm purple or I'm green, that brings you back to your habitual way of walking, because it has no real effect on your walking. And then back to the direction, which could be I'm free, or my neck is free, or my breathing's free, or whatever. I thought, well, how about I'm not doing as the direction? So I would invite you to do that experiment on your own, switching back and forth while walking around your studio. I think you'll have to change the camera angle to do that.
Sure, maybe, yeah. Let's see if I can do this seamlessly now.
Perfect. There, perfect walking space, the ideal. And
I would, good enough?
It's perfect. Yeah, and just walk around or back and forth or circles, whatever you're comfortable with, and just walk part of the time, a few steps with I'm not doing, and then a few steps with I'm green or I'm purple or some other nonsense thought, and then back again. And let me know if you can sense any difference in the quality of your walking, particularly your footfalls, how much pressure is going against the floor, how loud are your feet, that sort of thing are good indicators. And let me know what you've discovered.
every time I bring the I'm not doing thought to bear, I breathe more fully, spontaneously, and feel everything feels just a little bit easier. I don't think my walking was particularly heavy or awful. I didn't notice anything particularly about the sound, but I'm wearing just in my socks anyway. But yeah, it was interesting. Even though my general walking felt pretty nice, there was an added bonus. Interestingly, to me, it wasn't as the contrast wasn't as stark as when I was picking up the glass and sitting at my desk. And there may be something about moving and walking that for me generally is more freeing, and I don't know.
Well, it was just an experiment, but I found
that, yes, it had an effect.
It definitely has some kind of effect. If you could return to your desk so we could just close out the conversation, and I want to throw out a couple of ideas for our viewers. I found for myself that sometimes I don't feel a big difference in walking, but what sometimes I do, and in terms of students that I've worked with this, it's some immediately sense a difference and some don't. So who knows what that means? But what I would suggest as another experiment, that if anyone who's interested in playing with this some more, is to use that direction I'm not doing, and perhaps contrast it with a nonsense direction when you're doing constructive rest, for example, or when you're just lying down in bed. I found in both those situations, the big thing that just pops out is breathing. It gets fuller and easier and fuller. And I think those are good places to do it, because there's so little else going on that you're going to notice it more. But you noticed it even when you were just sitting, and someone watching this could experiment with just sitting.
The moment you first brought that in, and I thought it along with you and it just that was, in fact, that was probably the biggest moment, the very first time.
Oh, interesting.
But maybe
it's going to be different for everybody. And the kind of experiments that we've done, of picking up an object or moving a limb, that sort of thing, I'm sure anyone watching this, if they want to pursue it, could certainly do those experiments and come up with other ones. What I think is the most interesting is to go as far back in the movement as possible. So just when it's just a thought, already just the thought means there's still something going on. And what is it that goes on? And is it easier and lighter when you're using that direction I'm not doing? And then you could take it into the beginning of a movement, but no actual movement, what kind of pre-movement thing. And then you could take it the next step to, in the case of the book, for example, putting your hand around it and actually lifting it up and seeing, so you could do various stages of any movement. I think it's something that's worth exploring. And I will put a link by this interview to a page I've created about Margaret Goldie's teaching. And it'll have all the interviews I did with Penelope, as well as some other material, some biographical material, and some books you can get about people's experiences with her work. So that's...
I'm going to definitely experiment more with this myself, and my students will probably get to benefit from these experiments too.
Go ahead.
One last thing is that one of the things I was struck by in your interviews with Penelope was her use of the term coming to quiet or
Coming to
bringing,
quiet.
and it's anyway, that had been an idea I explored myself kind of with the freedom direction stuff a while ago, and it just was reminding me of that. But,
oh, so a possible direction would be I'm free to come to quiet.
I'm free to come to quiet, or
you know,
something like that. It wasn't exactly how I worded it, but I might experiment with that.
Yeah, I would experiment with, see if you, the viewer or listener, if this will be a podcast at some point, see if you can come up with your own directions that, because this is not, there's no standardization here yet. I mean, there's
I don't think there ever will be,
and
because
there
it's
probably never will
very
be.
personal what works better for one person.
I mean, for
but
me,
there are some general things that tend to help a lot of people. So
if you start coming up with directions, just a little word of warning, keep them short as possible, and just think them, don't do them. Of course, thinking is going to be a little bit of doing, but these are just mental directions, and they're not something that for you to do. You didn't do anything when you said, I'm not doing. In fact,
I think
really
that's maybe
what's the essence.
I think that's maybe what's so good about that one, because it's really clear I'm not doing.
It's a tough one to do.
Yeah.
And my sense is that the kind of effects it has on things like picking up a glass or lifting your leg or whatever are somewhat similar to what a negative direction or a freedom direction might bring about. But when you say I'm not doing, it kind of covers any conceivable action you might contemplate. Whereas typically we think, well, I'm not doing a specific thing like lifting my leg as a negative direction, or I'm not tensing my neck. But this is just I'm not doing, and it's pretty much everything. So anything else you want to add before we bring this?
I don't think so, but as usual, it's been very interesting, and I've learned something, and I've got something new to play with myself. So
well, you can't do better than that. So my guest today has been Imogen Ragone, an Alexander Technique teacher in Wilmington, Delaware. I'll put a link to her website by the interview. I'll also put a link to the page I mentioned about Margaret Goldie, where you can find a lot more information about her and the experience people have had of her work. She did not write anything herself, as far as I know. And I'll put a link to a site that will give you more information about the Alexander Technique. So, Imogen, thanks so much.
Thank you.